Okay, I'll just note that those two packages are downloaded already and I've got them here in a folder. So I've just got a folder on my desktop, in this case called Unity Demo. This is where I've stored my packages that I've downloaded. So we can see the FPS controller that's extracted from the standard assets. So you can just use this FPS controller and the Ancient Environment kit. So I've got those in one easy to find location, and this folder is where I'm going to work from. So let's get started. So in Unity Hub, what I'm going to do to start with is create a brand new project. Now from this pull down menu, you can select what versions of Unity you currently have installed. And again, if you're on a, say, university computer and we have multiple installs of Unity, often that's necessary because people will be working on projects and you want to stick on that one version. Always make sure you're working on the correct version. And don't automatically just update to the latest version and then suddenly your earlier projects don't work because you'll have various compile errors. There's a lot of technical aspects going on behind the scenes in Unity, and you want to make sure that you're working on the current version and you're doing everything you can, best practices, to try and avoid Unity getting confused and crashing on you. So for this, what I'm using is this version 2020.3.0 F1. If you go to the Unity website, and there's an archive of all the previous versions, so you can download any version that you want if you ever need a specific version. So in the new, I'm coming into the down arrow and picking that version, which was 2020.3.0 F1, and I'm just leaving it set to 3D, so we have a few different options, and I can name the project and I can tell it where. So where is, I'm just going to work on my desktop. I've got this folder called Unity Demo, so I've selected that location, and in there I want my entire Unity project. So, and that will be a folder that will be named whatever I call the name of the project. So let's say something like Getting Started Project 01. I tend to put little numbers after my project names, or at least my file names, trying to keep things organized. So I'm going to create that, and Unity will launch. All right, here we are in Unity, a brand new Unity project. Now you can see I've got the version number up here, and we're looking at the default layout that currently happens to have been set up. We have an option in the upper right window here for layout where we can change different types of layouts if we want to use different things. Some people like particular setups. It's very customizable, just like most 3D apps like Maya. Now, what we really want is to be able to see, just as we're learning, both the game and the scene view. So we have this scene view as our 3D view. Again, just like Maya, if I hold down the Alt key and my left mouse, I can orbit around, Alt and the clicking and holding the scroll wheel, which is the middle mouse, and Alt and the right mouse lets me zoom in and out. So very familiar for Maya users. Now the game view I can't manipulate. The way this works is when I hit the play button up here, we go into game mode. So if I wanted to see both, I could just click this tab and just drag it, just like most things where we can customize our viewport, move things around. Now I like a particular layout. I'm going to change it in this menu automatically for me, and that's 2x3, the very first one. So the layout button, 2x3, and I like this because it feels very much like Maya. So basically the inspector over here shows us our properties, essentially our attribute editor that we see inside of Maya. So if I had an object, I'm just going to quickly throw something. Actually, we already have a little sample scene here that has a camera and a light in our scene. And you can see when I select this directional light, for example, its properties appear here. Just like Maya in our attribute editor, we can click on these various settings and muck around with those. This is just like our 3D view in a 3D app like Maya. I can click and move these. I could hit the E key for rotate and rotate those on different angles. And you'll notice as I'm rotating those, the world is changing color because this is a directional light that's just basically the sun, essentially. Now, what I'm looking at here, this is called the hierarchy. So this tab, again, we can always move this around. For Maya, this is the closest analogy for this would be our outliner, which is typically on the left in Maya, and that shows us all of the objects that are in our scene. I'm going to dock this back to where it was, just over here. And then what we have here is our project, and it's got a little icon of a folder. This is very literally the Unity project folder. So if I open up the little demo scene that I was working with, for when I showed you, I only had these two packages, Unity packages. Now if I come into this, down here we can see there's something here called Getting Started. Remember when I started this project, I named it Getting Started 01, and Unity has gone and created this folder for me. Now I need to point out before I jump into this, don't change anything inside this project inside of Windows. Always use Unity to change things. So we're going to be later adding our ancient environment and our FPS controller to the scene. We want to actually load it inside this project folder. So this folder, this tab, exists for a very important reason, is that Unity needs to draw its internally, draw its connections between all the various files for us so that it knows where everything is and it doesn't crash and break when we try to run the game. If we start moving things around here inside of Windows, it could just crash. You know, if Unity wanted us to move things around the folder, we wouldn't even have this project window. The only reason this exists is it's intended to do everything inside that we can look at. But just to quickly show you, this is a Microsoft Windows folder, and getting started, if I open that up, this is our standard Unity project folder structure. Now, you actually want to ignore all of these. Never touch anything in here. The only thing we kind of care about and understanding is this assets folder, and this is where our scene lives. So in here we've got this folder called scenes, and I can see in my project folder I've got a thing called scenes. Unity likes this two column layout for the project folder. I think personally for most users, especially for a beginner tutorial, I actually find the multiple layouts can be slightly confusing. It's almost like too much information. So I'm actually going to change this to a single layout, which I can do just in there's three dots. Most programs will have it like a gear icon. So this is the settings. So I hit the three dots and it gives me settings, and I can change it from 2 column to 1 column. I just find this a bit simpler and easier to understand, especially explaining to people for the first time. And you can see how this relates to this Windows folder. I've got in here the assets folder. Inside of that is a folder called scenes, and inside of that is a thing called sample scene, and it's got this little icon that's the Unity logo. So that means it's a Unity scene asset. And if we take a look inside of Windows, it's the same thing. We've got our assets folder. So here's the assets, and inside that is scenes. We can just ignore this metadata. That's kind of like a Mayo workspace folder. Inside of scenes, we've got sample scene. So it's just useful to know that this is where things live. For the most part, though, we don't actually need to worry about how that's working. Let's just do everything inside of Unity and play it safe until you understand what's going on. So what we need to understand is the simple layout. So we've looked at the hierarchy, which is everything in our scene. So we can see we've got a camera and we've got a light. This is our scene that we're looking at. And what's this? Well, if I hit the play button, we should see nothing happens. If I hit maximize on play and hit the play button, what happens is this gives us a full screen. So this is basically our game. At the moment, it's literally just a camera, this camera looking through the scene, and all we've got is this basic environment. Very simple. This is standard camera skybox. So that gives us this sort of fading light. And we've got a light on our scene, but that's all there is to this game. There's not even gravity. There's nothing going on. So to start with, we can just quickly throw some things in. So objects, just like three-dimensional objects in Maya, 3D objects or OBJ, the objects inside of Unity are game objects. So the camera is a game object, the light is a game object, and 3D objects are game objects. So they're all under this menu, game object. So I'm going to go 3D object, and let's just, 3D object, let's make a plane. So this is basically what I'm going to use as the ground. And so I'll just hit R for scale and just scale that up. So I've got a larger ground space. And I'm going to go create 3D object cube. So I've got a cube on the ground. Now, if I want to start manipulating this, let's say what I want to do is duplicate this cube and have a couple. So Control D, D for duplicate. Control D lets me make another cube. But if I want to precisely layer this and snap it to each other, that's something you'll do all the time. In Maya, the way that works is holding down V for vert. When I hold down V for vert and move my cursor over what would be the vertices on that object, it snaps temporarily while I'm holding the V key. If I let go of V, it doesn't do that. So if I hold down V and then pick one of the corners and then click and drag, I am snapping, because I'm holding V for vert, I am snapping to other vertices. I could snap to this corner right here. So that's a really nice way to quickly position your objects, and snapping is a pretty critical tool. Now, I'm not happy with the color of this. If I were to start building a scene, so I've just selected my two objects. You can see I've accidentally named them W because I typed in W for move tool. Doesn't matter. If I go, let's just clarify that actually. I'm just going to double click that and rename it cube. So that's the original. Cool. Now if I shift select both of these in the hierarchy, that's the same as clicking in my scene. You can see when I click on one of them here, it highlights in the hierarchy. So we can see how this hierarchy is a collection of objects in my 3D scene. And I can shift select in there, or if it's a little bit confusing, if I've got a lot of stuff in my scene, maybe it's easier to just manually select them. Control D, I'm going to duplicate these, just undo that selection, duplicate. Okay, I've got a couple of objects, can't see them very well. So the next thing is, what we really want on our objects are materials. So let's make some materials. What I'm going to do is in my project, right click and go create material. And I'm just going to call this, let's say blue, and I'm going to go M, capital M, A-T, so camel case naming convention. Try not to put spaces and weird asterisks and weird symbols in your names. You wanted to, as I said, everything to stop Unity from crashing. We don't want to confuse it as much as possible. So keeping things simple, one word's like that's nice. And blue matte, I can read that and know, oh, that's my material because it says matte, and obviously that's the color blue. So when I select this blue matte in our inspector, which is like our attribute editor in Maya, we see all of the different properties. These little checkboxes are designed for plugging in textures. So that's something that we've seen before in 3D, where we can create textures in something like Substance Painter. So if we created our own smart materials and exported those, we can plug those textures straight into these attributes. But in this case, all I want to do is give it a solid color, which it has by default as white. I'm just going to click it, and since I called this blue, I guess I better give it a blue color. And I can drag that onto a cube. Now I've dragged that onto a cube in my scene. I could also drag it onto a cube in the hierarchy. It appears to be the same cube that I just selected. Drag it onto a cube here. So that's one way. It's a bit tedious this way to drag things on like this. I'll show you an important concept though that lets us speed that right up, and that's called prefabs. So let's say instead of 4 cubes, we've got 8. We've got 16. I'm just shift selecting all of them, Control D to double click. We've got 32 of these cubes. Can you imagine, and imagine if it was like some giant scene with hundreds of things that you decided you needed to change one little thing on all of them. And the material is a common thing that you'll want to change. That's going to be a hassle. Let's say I decide actually I want all of these red. No worries. I'm going to right click, create material, red, capital M matte, give it the red color. So there we are. We can see that little thumbnail. We've got a red material. clicking and dragging one by one is tedious. Now I could just select them all and drag them on, but look, it's not working. This method of selecting an object in my scene and just hitting Ctrl-D to duplicate it is not a great method when the object, you can see the color of it is kind of transparent. That's telling me that it's just a simple game object. It hasn't got anything fancy. It's a 3D cube. But what I really need is what's called a prefab. So a prefab is essentially a blueprint. So I can take one of these cubes, and what I'm going to actually do, let's just delete all of these. I'm just hitting, I've selected the object, I want to zoom in just on the object. F for focus, just like in Maya, zooms right in. Nice and easy, like Maya. Okay, so I've got this object. It's a cube. Notice in the attribute editor, we have a list of things on it. So we've got a red material here. It also has a couple of other things, this thing called a box collider. So that allows us when we play it to run through the object, or rather to not run through the object. When we run up to it, we'll hit a wall and stop. So it's a collider. And it's got a renderer, which allows us to see it, and the actual 3D mesh as well, the geometry. So we could add other components. So you have this component button. There's a whole lot of different things we could experiment with and add. There's physics. We could add effects, and could add audio. So as you approach it, it's making noise. Instead of having to build this every single time, we can turn this into a prefab, which is a blueprint that says to Unity, this is how this thing works. It's a very simple way to make a prefab. Is you assemble how you want. In this case, it's everything I want. It's got my shader, and it's got the standard objects for rendering and colliding. I grab the object once it's finished and just drag it into the project window. Now, as soon as I do that, notice this goes blue. And what it says up here in the inspector when I have this selected, this cube, it says cube, and then in brackets, this is a prefab. What does that mean? Well, now that I've got this as a prefab, we'll do the same thing. I'm going to undo that. Control, duplicate, select them both, duplicate. Let's duplicate again. Just make a bunch real quick. See that multiplies rather quickly. Now, if I decide I want all of those to be blue, I don't have to click and drag one by one. Now it does work if I want to do that, and what I'm doing when I do that is changing that instance, only that instance. In other words, that cube, that prefab inside of my hierarchy takes on a new material. But if I want to change all of them, I can just change the original prefab. So we've got the red shader. I can say, no, I'm meant to have the blue shader on this, and look what happens. Every single instance of that prefab, which is all of these, changes instantly. So if you're making a game, let's say a 3D platformer game, and you need to put a lot of objects in there, and there's going to be repeated instances of similar objects, say for example a floating ground tile, and at any point down the track you decide you want to make some change to all of those instances of that tile. So you've made a floating ground tile out of, I don't know, you've hand painted some rock, and then you turn around and look at the game and go, hang on, that rock is not very good. I can do much better than that. And you paint it a little bit differently and with a much nicer appearance on it. If it's a prefab, you can just click and drag it onto the one, and all of the rocks will instantly change to that modern updated texture that you've created. If you didn't make this prefab system, you're going to have to click and drag manually one by one in a very tedious, slow process. So this concept is really quite important to understand to how to make games efficiently. Otherwise, it's going to take a long time and be quite slow. So that's the core concepts of how to use Unity. That's really all we need to get started. We understand the interface. We haven't looked at how to actually move around in our game and what this does yet. So I'll come back to that. But I want to make, instead of just a boring little scene, we'll make an actual environment. We've looked at what the inspector is. So the inspector, the project, the hierarchy. We've looked at game objects, which are literally any objects in your scene. It's important to understand the terminology though. If you're ever coding or if you're even looking at other people's code, you will need to understand the concept of what a game object is. It's a very simple concept, but that's the terminology that we're using. We have actually looked briefly at components. So components are the objects we can see here in the inspector on this cube. The material is a type of component. There's all these other things like colliders. If we look at components, we can add them in here. Not that we need to understand what they all do just yet, we just need to know they're there. And we've looked very importantly at prefab. So before we make our little environment with the terrain and the ancient ruins, let's just throw in the character controller and run around so we can see how you actually play a game. Pretty basic concept, and what it shows us is how to import a package. So in my project folder, I'm just going to right click and go import package, custom package, and then I'll navigate to where I've saved it. I've got this folder on the desktop where I've saved an FPS controller. I can go open, and what it does is bring up a window that says what's in that package, and we can see it's got the FPS controller and all the dependencies. There's audio here for the footsteps. There's a whole bunch of scripts for doing various things that the vast majority of we're not going to need. And there's actually a bunch of leftover scripts from other aspects of the standard assets folder. So if you're importing the standard assets folder, this will be much larger and we'll bring everything in, and you're welcome to do that. But for now, I'm just going to bring in the FPS. So go import. That will think for a second. And what we'll see is this will load into the projects folder. So here we go. It's created a new folder called FPS controllers. So what I've created here is a bit of a messy scene. I've got this cube and this material just randomly floating there. So just be aware, generally when you're working in a game, you need to be a lot more organized than just throwing everything into the root folder of the project folder. So FPS controllers, and here we have a first-person controller. Now before I add this, what I need to point out is that this has its own camera attached to it. So if I just add this, I've already got a camera in my scene. You can see this camera. So I'm actually going to remove that. I'm going to select this camera and hit delete. And what we see is the game view disappears because there are now no cameras in my scene. We can see in the scene view, it's all there, there's no problems, but nothing in the game. So when we hit play to play the game, it's just going to be black. We're not looking through a camera. So now if I grab the prefab for the FPS controller, I can just click and drag that. I can either do it into the hierarchy. If I do that, it appears in the middle of the scene. If I undo that, I can also click and drag it into the scene. And straight away down the bottom there, we can see what's happening. As I add this object to my scene, this camera, it's interacting with the world. So this is this camera that we're seeing through. Basically, this is our camera view. So I can position, just clicked off it there, we can position this anywhere we want. But I'm just going to leave it there for now, that's fine. So I've turned off maximize on play because I just want to see the game in here plus see what's happening in my scene view at the same time. Now when I hit the play button up here, it thinks for a second and the game starts. I can look around. That white floor is actually a bit hard. I probably should have put a material on it. As soon as I start moving, it's popped up. We can see the character in the top screen there is looked. As I move, we can hear steps, different sound effects as I jump. I can hold shift and run, and we can look around the world and can move through here, and we can collide. So I'm hitting these cubes. I can't walk through them because they're in the way. They have box colliders on them, which stops me from walking through them. I can hit shift and jump on top. In fact, right here, we've got the basics for a game. What I can do is I'm just going to hit the escape key, which gives me my cursor back. I can hit stop. So I hit the play button again to stop playing. What I meant by the basics of a game, I could just move these up and create like a little, basically a type of platformer where I have to jump up. So if I hit play again, I hit spacebar, and you can see my character's slowly jumping up on top of these objects. Now, here's an important concept. If I just hit escape so I get my cursor back, if I hit pause instead of the play buttons, and the game is paused, and if I make a change, that's all great. So maybe what I want to do is test, and that's what this is designed for, is testing something. And I hit unpause, the game continues, and these objects that I've just moved are now repositioned. And I might just quickly test it and go, yep, that works for what I intended for jumping over it. Watch what happens. Watch up here, these 3 cubes that I've just moved, as I hit the play button and stop the game. They just reset back to the ground. So this pause button is intended purely to try things, and it will completely reset those settings when you stop playing the game. So if you ever want to try something and keep its position, you need to make sure that you're not simply pausing, but you're actually playing and then hitting the play button to stop playing. So you can see I'm not in play mode. If I make some changes, let's try, whoops, maybe I'll make a wider platform. I'll just scale it. So now that I've done that, I'm not in play mode. Now when I hit play, you'll see they stay where they are. And I can test my little game, and I can hit play and they don't move. Or I can go, okay, that was cool, but what if I add, I'm just going to pause it and go, well, what if I make this back here? I just want to test that position and unpause it. I can test it and go, no, I don't really like that jump. Or actually, yeah, that kind of worked, whatever. Hit the play button, it will reset, but now I know that works. So it's really important. I've seen people when they're brand new to Unity get excited with this sort of layout stuff. They're trying things and haven't understood that concept of pausing will forget when you stop playing the game. And I've seen them spend like 20 minutes carefully positioning a whole bunch of content, and then they hit stop and that it all resets. They lose it all. That's annoying. So you want to make sure that you're understanding this concept of use the play button to start and then the play button to stop. It's fairly rare, to be honest, that you need the pause button. It's really only if you're playing with attributes, if you want to change a parameter in the inspector and see what that does. And it's nice that you can try things, maybe take note of what value you put in, and then you can hit the play button and it will reset and you won't damage your game unexpectedly. All right, so we've got the basics of a game working of sorts, but let's make something a little bit more interesting. So what I'm going to do is make a brand new scene. Now, if I wanted to return to this exact scene, in other words, this hierarchy with all of these objects in my scene laid out as they are, I'd need to save it. So I could go File, Save, because I've already saved it once. This is called Sample Scene 02. So I can go File, Save. Now what I'm going to do is go File, New Scene, brand new scene, just a 3D scene, create. I've got nothing in my scene. You can see the hierarchy is cleared. First thing I want to do is save it, so save scene as. And in my scenes folder, make sure I'm in there. And this one I'm going to call Ruins Demo. Save. So we've got Ruins Demo, which has basically nothing. If I wanted to, at any time, I can go Open Scene, make sure I'm in the right folder, and there's my sample scene 02, and go Open, and it all comes back. Or if I've open scene, if I've actually made something in this ruins demo, I can hit open and I come back to this.